Awesome. I'm glad you guys could all make it. I know sometimes with New York, there's security and different protocols to go through to attend these events, but I'm glad you guys are all here. My name is Tony. I work at Mucker Capital. We are an early stage venture firm. Basically, we invest in seed and Series A. We also run an accelerator program that can be participated in remotely called Mucker Lab. So if you guys are curious about what we do and what kind of companies we invest in, feel free to come talk to me after this session. But today, or at least for this session, we have 3 sessions here. For this session, we are going to be going through a live vibe coding called, actually, let's go through. Live vibe coding Iron AI Chef. Okay, so we did this at LA Tech Week last year, and we wanted to take the show on the road, and we'll probably keep doing it. I'll have the participants introduce themselves in a bit, but really the goal for today is not really a competition per se, although I know Elizabeth is pretty competitive herself, but it's meant to let all of us get an inside look in how expert builders think as they're going through live vibe coding, or as they're going through vibe coding. For those of you who are new to vibe coding, I think this is a great opportunity to get a sense of how things are done. If you guys are experts, then maybe next year you guys could come and also participate as a participant. So come talk to me. But really, I want to thank first of all, our partner, JustWorks, and Tessa, as she mentioned, introduced herself. Definitely take advantage of the offer that she has on the QR code. If you need it again, she can provide it. So yeah, I think the great thing is with Tech Weeks, it's just a great way for the tech ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, to get together, to help each other and to grow and to get resources. So if you guys are a builder, you guys are going to have a great week if you haven't attended Tech Week before. All right, let's introduce our participants. Why don't we go down the line and why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi guys, I'm Zakir. I'm a third-year undergrad at Drexel, and I'm also a campus leader for Livable. So through Livable, I've been running a lot of vibe coding workshops, and that's been the work I've been doing.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I work as a design program manager at Ramp, and I also run an online design school called Design's a Party. I teach designers how to vibe code with tools like Cursor and Claude.
Hey everybody, my name's Rock. I'm the founder and CEO of Eazy, and we help small, medium-sized businesses with the implementation of AI and automation.
Awesome. Welcome, guys. Throughout this presentation, definitely feel free to ask questions. I'm going to be asking questions as well. But if you have any pressing questions, just raise your hand and we'll run the microphone to you. Again, this is a learning environment. It's not a hackathon or anything. So definitely, if you guys have questions, come up. Don't be shy. All right. Okay, so for today's exercise, all right, I provided these guys with a prompt, with an idea. And so their challenge is to go and create this app. And you guys can see on the screens, they're going to actually share their screens along the way. But the app idea or agent that they're going to create is self-serving to Mucker, but we're already working on this ourselves. But essentially, we have 2 groups of people. As a VC firm, we have our founder community, the portfolio companies that we invest in. And then in another group, we have what we call operating experts, which are third-party advisors and mentors that we reach out to and say, hey, would you be willing to volunteer your time to mentor some of our founders? So we've got these 2 groups of people, and our founders are coming from all different types of backgrounds, different types of portfolio companies and industries and markets. Same thing with our operating experts. Some of them are experts in AI, some are enterprise sales for 20 years, some of them are multi-time founders. And we got these 2 groups of people, and the idea is to matchmake them. Because currently, the process is, and I wish I had taken some screenshots, founders can actually go into the Mucker's website and log into the founder portal, go in there and browse through our database of operating experts using basic search queries around tags and, hey, I'm looking for someone in the automotive space who can connect me with General Motors or whatever. And so they would search and it would go through that person's profile. But it's very much a manual process. So the app idea or challenge that I'm presenting to the 3 of you is to create an app or an agent that could proactively do the matchmaking for these groups of people. Because the operating experts, the advisors, they're a fantastic resource that, quite frankly, our team, we haven't really seen our founders really taken advantage of because they probably don't know what they don't know or what they don't know what they need just yet, okay? So that's the app agent idea. What I provided them is access to 2 Airtable bases. This is where we keep our database of both of these parties. And that's it. That's all they had access to. We'll keep this up, all right? You guys are building, if you guys, any one of you want to volunteer, why don't you tell me, how are you thinking about starting? First, what tools are you thinking about? And for whether or not you're just going to dive right in, is your approach just to write a first prompt, or do you do some pre-planning ahead of time? Any volunteers who want to take that first question? Go ahead and pick up the microphone.
Yeah, so typically I sometimes like to do planning, and other times I like to jump into it and see what happens first. I think a lot of times when you experiment first and get a sense of what's possible, then you can try again and do better the second time. And so my mentality is to not overthink it and jump in and see how it goes. What I'm planning to do today is I'm going to do a really simple solution that I think anyone could do in a few minutes. And then I'm going to do a more exploratory solution. And so probably going to focus on making a skill for my Claude agent first that can just take the 2 databases and really do matchmaking directly through Claude. And then I also want to do some explorations that are more on the design side and show you how designers might think through a problem like this.
Yeah, and I think in that same vein, there's different options and ways you can approach putting a system like this in place. And I think depending on what you're trying to do, both sort of approaches can have value, where to some extent just going into it and iterating on a solution is a good scrappy way to create a version 1. And then simultaneously have it be more of a structured project or more of a system where you have some idea of what it should look like, doing what we call pre-production and then working backwards from what your ideal result is and the sort of user journey can help make the design decisions and architecture, et cetera. But I'll be using just Claude Code, Claude app on my Mac pretty much out of the box. And I do generally use the plan mode based on my prompt and work on an action plan before we actually have Claude build some things. But yeah, I'm thinking about what should it look like, what's the user journey, and based on those bullet points, trying to structure it around that.
Want to add anything, Zakir?
Yeah, so just echoing their words, I think like diving right into it, it's definitely useful. Something that I've been experimenting with is if I want to make a product that I want to scale or like I want to make more reliable, I first start with the GitHub repo, which is like the simplest way to get something going with snapshots, where I think Claude and these vibe coding tools are really good when you give them small chunks of tasks. I've seen is like, instead of just dumping, I want to make a web app that does this, for example, it's really helpful to like brainstorm with Claude, break it down into like really small pieces. And then you can even make like an agentic Kanban board, which a lot of PMs use, where you put in like small tickets. And then if you can break down that bigger problem into like smaller components, Claude's really good at like creating the web app from those smaller pieces, especially if you have a GitHub. And the benefit with that is if you have a GitHub, it prevents like bloat, where instead of the agent just going in loops, it's really good at like adding small changes that cumulatively compile into a bigger web app. And at the same time, if you make an error or a mistake, like you can always revert and then keep going from that point onwards. So yeah, similar to them as well. Like I'll be using Claude like in Cursor and like making like a simple version as well as a more complex version of that.
So which one of you want to start sharing your screen and kick off the process? Any volunteers? All right, awesome. And while Elizabeth is pulling up her screen, and this is going to be how we're going to be doing this session. As each person shares their thought process, they're going to open up their screen and actually show you what they're inputting into the tools. And also I'll mention, I think it's great that all 3 of our participants have very different backgrounds, from university student starting his own business as well. We got Elizabeth, a designer working at Ramp, and Rock owning his agency and consultancy, focusing on workflows and operations. Unless I'm mistaken, I don't think any of you have 15 years of software development engineering experience, right? So there you go. You don't need to have that as a background to build today. Okay, Elizabeth, how are we setting this up here?
This is going to seem like a little lazy, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take exactly the text you sent me over the email, and I'm going to paste all this information into Claude. I'm not even using Claude Code. Basically, what I'm going to ask Claude to do is, the keynote here is that I'm asking it to, oh, the zoom in doesn't work, but I'm asking it to create a skill for me that will do exactly this. So if you don't know what a skill is, basically a set of instructions that your agent can follow that you can basically save and then it will follow it every time. And I think a lot of times people default to making an app for something when you don't even need an app. You can basically use the agents you already have access to, whether it be Claude or ChatGPT, and you can train it to do the thing you want it to do. And so this is a very going to be like a less visual representation of like matchmaking. But basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna paste this prompt in here. It says create a skill. And what a skill is basically a markdown file. A markdown file is basically a bunch of text and a bunch of human readable instructions. It might sound scary, but if you Google like skill examples, you'll find a bunch of markdown files and you'll be able to read them and really understand how a skill works. It's written in plain language. And right now, something that I'm doing that I didn't mention is that I've connected my Claude to Airtable, which is where this information is stored. So this is really easy. You basically press a button and then your Claude is able to read what is in Airtable, and you don't even have to do any integrations with code. You don't have to connect an API. I'm basically using the Airtable MCP. And so this is a very easy way to get started. And so it's probably going to take a second to load. But basically right now you'll see that it's pulling the information from the table and what fields are in the table. I think one thing I highly recommend is if you're new to vibe coding or working with AI, a lot of people will ignore what the AI is telling them, but I actually think it's important to read or at least scan what it's saying because help you understand better how it thinks. And even though it's not really thinking, but how it thinks, and then also how to work with AI in the future. This might take a second, so if someone else wants to go, I can wait for this to finish running.
Can you clarify for the audience, if they're brand new at this, which we'll have to assume, did you choose to use Claude? And just to also clarify, you were using the desktop app and not the web application.
Sure, yeah. So there's no difference between the Claude desktop app and the Claude web app for what I was doing because I was talking to Claude Chat. I'm really doing this in Claude Chat. I'm not using Cowork or Claude Code. And I picked Claude because that's the one I pay for on my personal computer, to be honest. They're all very similar. I think I started off with Claude. I like Claude's personality a little bit more. Other people like ChatGPT. I don't know anyone who prefers Gemini, which is fine. But I think really pick the one that works best for you. They're always changing. The best model is always changing. So don't get fixated on one. I'm just using Sonnet 4.6 today because it's cheaper and I think it doesn't need to be using the most complicated model.
Great, thank you.
No, it's a great point. And I think these things are changing constantly. And I think to Tony's earlier point where you've got people with decades of experience, people with just a couple of years of experience, many of these tools didn't exist even just a couple of years ago. So I think having this mindset of being a lifelong learner and not getting too attached to any specific AI tool or AI models. But for what it's worth, a lot of what I'm seeing in the business world, at least, is that Claude is having pretty broad usage and compared to some of the alternatives. And there's different sort of tools that you can use. And Claude has a desktop app that is quite good called Claude Code. And they have this other tool called Claude Cowork that can interact with files, et cetera. And even out of the box, it's quite useful. And the earlier point made about how you've got the different models within these systems, you don't always need to use the sort of heaviest model that exists. So Claude released Opus 4.8 a couple days ago, but experiment with it and find the right tool for the right job. And this use case that we're talking about with searching over a data set beyond just keywords is actually a really hot topic in the AI space. And I'll just share a little bit kind of the thought process. I did a little bit of pre-processing of some of the data from Airtable where basically I took some of the columns of data that existed and I put them into what's called the embedding space. What does that mean? A lot of AI tools basically are actually, when you're typing words into it and it's turning into tokens, it's actually turning the tokens into essentially what are called vector representations. They're long strings of numbers that it's used to do this sort of statistical analysis. And you can do that as well with data. And so when you're doing these sort of natural language searches, I've created a graphic and I Vibe created this graphic with Claude actually. But basically what we're saying here is if you do a query and you say growth marketing advisor, for example, the word growth marketing advisor in this sort of abstract embedding space of just numbers is essentially more similar to things like growth marketing expert than it is to legal compliance specialist. So when you're doing this sort of natural language search, it's doing this sort of similarity comparison. And so the pre-processing of the data I did looks like this. Basically, took the data from Airtable. This is what's called a JSON object. But you can see that for some of these columns, we've got these large strings of numbers, basically. So in this case, it's a little over 1,000 of these sort of comma-separated numbers per row. And embeddings is something that you'll be thinking about when you're doing these things. And I've got a prompt that I created. It's pretty long, but basically I'll just be pasting this into Claude here. And you'll notice that in the bottom left here, I've got it in what's called plan mode. And essentially that's exactly what it sounds like. Claude will interpret my prompt, and then it will produce a plan, and then we'll collaboratively decide to do it, or I'll revise it. To Elizabeth's point, probably don't need to use Opus 4.8, but YOLO. So actually, this is an interesting thing. So you can use things like Claude to optimize your prompt. So you can even, it's meta, but you're vibe prompting, if you will, where you're telling Claude, pasting the prompt from Tony, and then we're turning this into a prompt. And I worked through some of the architecture decisions in my mind where for this demo, I created that sort of data set, and I'm using a Python library called Streamlit to create the interface. And so for demos, that's probably sufficient. To get this into production, I'll kind of talk a little more about that if we can get something running successfully here. But definitely you can iterate on your prompt with AI models, and you can ask it to do things. And one of the things that I have in my sort of rather long prompt here is I'm asking it, in addition to creating this demo, to test it before it comes back to me and says that it's ready. So you can actually have it go through a sort of QA process. So I'll pop that in, and then I'll pass the mic over. But I've got a couple different sort of prompts, and so we'll see if this works. But there's no code examples or anything in the prompt. It's just pretty long sort of description of what we're trying to do. So we'll put that in. And I've got it on 4.8 with medium effort. One of the things you'll find, especially if you don't use plan mode and you have it in higher effort, is it can get stuck thinking for really long times. So you can even see it thinking for up to 40 minutes at times. So yeah, it's cooking, if you will. No pun intended.
Awesome. Well, Zakir pulling that up. I think that's for any of you guys who are brand new at this, I think that's one of the common fears or misunderstanding is not knowing what to prompt, which is fair. Again, I think the point that Rock brought up is you can ask the chat, the LLM, to ask you questions. Have the bot prompt you just by simply saying things like, ask me questions to clarify certain things. You could literally type that into your prompt or something similar. There's like a ask user question, I forget what they call it in Claude. Yeah.
Yeah, just echoing their words again. I had a very similar process to the both of them as well, where instead of me like writing the prompt or like going into depth, I took like exactly the prompt that we had for the product. And I think, especially for me, like for people starting out, I think Cursor does a really good job at not black boxing the whole process, where you can see it at least like iterating through how the model's thinking. So for me, I just went with a very like one-liner thing saying analyze the following prompt, and then use sub agents to do like more research on like the best ways that we can implement this. And like one of the almost like tips that I have is with using agents to vibe code, like the most important thing perhaps is like optimizing your context windows, because they have like really small relatively context windows when you're coding. So instead of like, for example, for this app, right, the thought process is we want to make like a founder expert matching platform. There's things that you might want to research, right? What are some good algorithms for matching people, right? Like how do dating apps do it, for example, right? And how I can implement that for my product. What's like some good UI, UX? What are these other things that I can use to upgrade my setup? And instead of doing it on the main like chat window, as you'll see here, it's always better to use sub agents, because when you use a sub agent, like it can go do research without filling up the context window. And that results in like better outputs. So I'll just go ahead and paste the prompt that we got. Yeah, and like you'll just see Cursor has like plan mode, and I use like Composer because it's always like cheaper to run the models for like longer periods of time, especially if you're not like deploying it into the real world. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question. Yeah. And like again, Cursor does a really good job at showing it, right? So if you see the screen, like when you just type in like use sub agent, it uses sub agents, and like you can see the 3 sub agents that like spawned on the side that are like loading. With Claude Code, and there's other harnesses that exist, right? Like it would just, this is like Claude Code that's running like in the terminal, right? For that, it would just like where you see the different like bullet points, it would just say like sub agent running, and it would have an animation that shows you. But like with Cursor, it's super like visual, and then you can click into each one of the sub agents and see what they're doing.
Okay. So each of you guys basically took the prompt and either just copied and pasted, or the instructions and copied and pasted, or added additional instructions, and you basically let the agent run. So what's next? What's going through your head as the output comes up, what's your next step?
I like to think about this is like you just see a lot of text like popping up as like the model does the work, right? This is something that I've been running like for a more in-depth like product. Most of your time is honestly just spent with like output like this or very similar, right? And it to some extent gets confusing because you won't be able to read 2,000 lines and interpret what's going on. But you can use like skills and extensions that do a better job at this. But like ideally what you want to do is look at after these huge chunks of text, like you can see at least like how much progress the model's making or like where it is in like the thought process, right? And most of the work that the human has to do is just like guiding. It's almost like you have a very smart child that doesn't know where to go, right? Like it's really fast, but you have to keep on almost like nudging it to the right direction. And the way that you do it, which is like why I also said like it's better if you already like pre-break it into like smaller chunks because those do a much better job at guiding the model. But for something like this is like just read like almost like peruse through what the model's doing, and anytime you think that the model's like going in the wrong direction, you can either stop it and tell it to go in the right direction, or you can use like I think another thing is like also when it runs, it's going to have some sort of an output that you can validate, right? So if it for this it's like a web app, for example, you can see the web app and you're like, okay, this is wrong, that's wrong, this is wrong, and then you can tell it to do like a root cause analysis of like why it went wrong, and then tell it to fix those things and then keep going.
Okay.
Yes. Am I sharing what happened or should I talk about what I do when I'm waiting?
Both.
Okay, I'll do both.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let me share my screen. A lot of people will ask me what to do when you're waiting for the AI to finish thinking because it takes a while. And what I always just start another agent. So I just start building other stuff. Usually as a designer, I'm usually creating visual explorations in the background while I'm getting something to work. Did it work? So this is the skill on the right side that was generated from my previous prompt. So you'll see that as a bunch of text and you can actually understand what it's saying. You don't have to be scared of this field ID, but basically like when you look through it, it's basically talking about these are how the databases are structured and this is the workflow the agent is going to follow in order to figure out the best matches. While the other participants were going, I asked Claude, what are some example prompts I can use to test out this skill? And so what you can do is you can basically save the skill so that anytime you open Claude, you can access the skill. And this skill is called Mucker Matchmaking. And so to summon a skill, you basically use the / key on your keyboard. And I'm going to pretend that I'm like, maybe this is my prompt. I'm a technical co-founder and need help thinking through our go-to-market strategy. Who should I talk to? And so you'll see right now what the agent is going to do is it's going to go through the workflow that it created based on my prompt earlier. And it's going to look through the Airtables that I have and in theory, find me the best person or people to talk to accomplish this goal. While that is going, I wanted to show you something that designers have been using today. And so a lot of times people are fairly visual and want to see multiple visual representations of something before diving into it. And so wanted to show you something called the Paper app. So Paper is a canvas that is agent driven. And so a lot of times in my workflow, I might ask an agent to create some different visual variations of something. Maybe we can use Opus 4.8 today. So some visual representations of something before actually building it. And I guess for this one, maybe what we can do is we can do like a visualization of maybe the mentors database so that we can see what that might look like. I think that would be more fun visually. And so what I can say is, does anyone use voice to text? We'll do that. So I'll say, I want to use Paper to create 5 different variations of a visualization that will highlight the skills and expertise in the Mucker's experts database. And so I have this prompt and I'm going to paste, give me 1 second. Paste the link to this Airtable.
I could hold your microphone for you.
All good. And I realized that this might not work immediately because I think I have a permissions issue, but in theory, what will happen is this will finish running and then there will be mockups that show up here the next time you see my screen. So we'll have to wait a few minutes, but next time you talk to me, something will show up.
Okay.
That was cursor.
Awesome. What's your progress going?
Yeah, and I would say that one of the things to really be thinking about is when you are when you're waiting for the AI model to be working, you can open other sort of sessions and be simultaneously doing things. And to that same point we talked about with using an AI model to optimize your prompt, you also can use it to QA and critique the outputs of other sessions. And so the use of skills, I really want to echo that skills can be incredibly useful when you're really doing all kinds of things with AI models, and having sort of repeatable processes without having to type prompts or have it learn new techniques is critical. And these things go down sometimes too. I'm sure we've all seen sort of the days when Claude goes down and then we go to Sweet Green or something for a little bit. But having access to different tools and having backup plans is also helpful as well. But here on the Claude interface, we've got a plan that looks pretty good. I'm going to accept it. One of the things that I did also was I actually had Claude, in creating this prompt, look at Mucker's website and actually say, what is the blue that Mucker uses? What's their logo, etc. So in my folder here, I do have the Mucker logo, so that could be embedded in the interface. And so having these different files and other kind of information that go into this prompt is going to help it be a little more personalized. And you can have a sort of design paradigm and sort of design style guide as part of your skill as well. And that's not the case with what I'm doing here, but it's something to reflect. The other thing that I want to emphasize is in this topic of the embedding space, I'm just going to pull up, and again, Vibe created this graphic. And if you are seeing graphics on LinkedIn that look mysteriously like this across people's accounts, you wonder what's going on. But the phenomenon of design converging into a central aesthetic is a topic probably for another day. But when you're creating these search systems, and this is something that we've done kind of more broadly, you've got the embeddings process that I talked about. But with these AI models, when you're using their, not to get too much into the weeds about it, but when you're using these APIs for producing responses, you can have what's called a structured output, where it's returning predictable data objects that you can then use for downstream software systems. And so what I'm doing here is, in addition to embedding my query that can be compared to those embeddings that I showed you before, I'm actually using a hybrid process where I'm using a Python library called BM25 that does ranking against the sort of search options. But critically, I'm having the AI model in my system return basically also other things like filters and a more advanced prompt to help it be a little more powerful. And so when you're doing these systems, you can't rely just on semantic search alone, because if you say like somebody that's not specialized in marketing, for example, then it will break if you do just embeddings. So while Claude's cooking, I'll pass the mic over on that. Anybody else?
Yeah, Zakir, you want to?
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Yeah, so those are some really great points. And I just wanted to almost show how easy it is to vibe code something, right? This is the prompt that I put into Cursor early on. And it's as simple of a prompt as you can go. I think there's almost like, it's pretty overwhelming to see a lot of people coming up with a lot of different harnesses. Or if you go on Twitter, there's someone that's come up with a new way to run agents that's 10 times better that you keep on seeing every day. And I think it's like, there's this group of people that are like, to have the most optimal setup for agents, and they spend more time optimizing the agents than using them, right? But for someone that's starting out, or if you want to get to an MVP as quickly as possible, it doesn't have to be as complicated as far as the fundamentals are on point, right? And this is almost like a presentation of that, where a very simple prompt, it took about 5 minutes, and you have a website that's pretty much running. I didn't put my API key in yet, so the AI won't work, but you have something that looks pretty good. There's a few rough edges, obviously, but for the prompt that we had, you have something that's almost good to go, right? And it has a lot of embedded functionality that comes in. You can change themes and templates. You can type in what you want as a founder, for example, what kind of help you want from the experts. And then Cursor also included like a conversation history once you start talking to these experts, as well as a directory of all the experts that were on the Airtable. We need to import their photos, obviously. But from the Airtable, there was like a very simple database. You now have a visual representation of every single expert, what they do. And then, so this was just showing how it works. Might try it to see if it works.
Can you talk about what you put into that prompt to get to this output?
Yeah, it's almost a bit embarrassing where I just said, analyze the following prompt. Use sub-agents to perform more research. And then I just put exactly the text that you sent me. And that was it to get to this level. But with something like that, obviously, once you have something that you can see, there's a lot of things that you want to keep on improving to the points that are made. I just said, look at the Mucker Capital website. and let's replicate their design language. And then you can just keep on putting literally one-line prompts until you get to something that works.
And what I found is sometimes when I just let it run, I'll have something beautiful like this,
Yeah.
but then the functionality I need to improve upon, like you just mentioned, now won't work with whatever tech stack was decided upon by the model. So how are you thinking about how this is going to actually become useful?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's the reason why I've been running two separate, almost like demos, right? Where I think this is really good for a visual prototyping almost of like how I want the website to look and mapping out the user interactions. And then there's more of the backend work where it's if I was to make a production grade platform, what would that tech stack look like, right? So it's like almost bridging the front end and the back end. For something like that works really well. Obviously, this isn't the best approach because even if I navigate through the website, a lot of things are like broken, right? But I think the way that I like to do it is I could actually just show you the chat where I did the exact same thing with the embedding space, right? Where you talk to Claude, you come up with rhythms, like the full tech stack on the back end for how it works, like a system architecture almost. And then if you were to tell Claude to build this, from my experience, it builds it, but it doesn't look good. And then with this, it looks good, but it doesn't work, right? So it's like it's an interesting problem. So it's huh?
So the Claude one doesn't work.
Yes, if you just tell it to run the infrastructure and the architecture, like from my experience, it doesn't look the best, but it works. And then like for something like this, it looks decent, it doesn't work as well, right? But the best thing that I've seen is like you start with something that's very well like fleshed out, you get it to work, and then like with something like this, once you have like almost like a visual understanding of what the interaction should look like, what colors I should use, what text I should use, you can put that into the thing that's working on the back end so that it looks like good. Almost. Also, like one more thing, if you understand like the user and like how they're using your website, you're able to design better architectures for that use case. Almost like the website could do its job really well, but if you're not gearing it towards like how the user is using it, then like the functionality isn't like useful kind of thing.
Cool. All right. Let's keep going.
Okay, hold on. Screen share. All right, so 2 updates from my end. So earlier we were like using that skill in Claude and you'll see that it finished running. So remember I was like saying that I'm a technical co-founder, I'm looking for a go-to-market strategy person. And you'll see here that it's pulled up 6 different people that it thinks I should talk to. And the prompt that I sent it originally was this is from the actual database. And the prompt that I sent it originally was like pretty vague, but imagine if I was like more specific about who I was, maybe where I'm located, any other requests that I have, it'll do its best to find the best matches in the database. And so a lot of times you don't actually even need to create an app. Basically, you can put a skill inside Claude and then it will create these little cards for you and you can already learn a lot. The other thing I was doing, which is like a side quest, is so I'm running the Paper MCP, which allows Paper, which is this kind of Figma-like app, to draw out different iterations of different designs. And you'll see that right now it's in progress. It's actually a really cool tool. It's a little hard to see, but you'll see there's this loading tool on the top right because the agent is currently generating these visualizations. I don't know why the colors are so ugly, but basically, remember my original request was for it to look at all the people in the experts database and then visualize where their expertise lay. And you'll see that I told it to create 5, and in the last 5 minutes, it's created 3-ish. And this is actually based off the data that is actually in the Airtable. The cool thing about using Paper first is that as a designer, I can actually go in, these are all clickable layers. So I can go in and I can change things and really explore visually what I want something to be first, and then really bring this back into code by pasting a link to it inside of the cursor chat or agent chat, and then it can actually make it real. And so for me, because I'm a more visual thinker, having a canvas like this where I can actually click around, move things around, this is really bad, but in theory, it's like you're moving stuff around and then you can do whatever you want. You can change the typefaces, you can do whatever you want, and then you can go back and actually implement it, because implementation is a little bit more expensive, and being able to explore visually in a canvas tool like that is a little bit easier for me.
Well, and I think that a really important point was just made that I think is poignant and has a lot of implications for the future is the paradigm of an application is changing in a way that you don't necessarily need a dedicated application to have this kind of functionality. So I think that was a really powerful point that was just made, where these sort of interfaces that are made more on the fly or based on skills is, I think, how a lot of sort of future systems are going to look, where it's this blended, centralized interface as opposed to it being these separate apps that you have to connect with APIs and such. And the fact, too, that a lot of what we were just talking about is AI agents interacting with other systems. They don't necessarily need the user interface to do that. And so I think it's quite interesting. And okay, so we've got kind of Claude has returned my response here. And again, a small amount of pre-work that was done before kind of moment of truth here to see if this is working. I did put what's called an env file with what's called environment variables into my folder here. And basically, it's just a best practice when you're building kind of apps locally for the API key that I have for, in this case, OpenAI. I did use the Embeddings 3 small model to create these embeddings, and I'm using their nano model. For things like this, you can get away with using these nano models if you're building applications. They're quite powerful and they rock bottom pricing, but just want to emphasize that. I think a lot of the time when we're vibe coding, security can be on the back burner in the conversation, but I think it's important to emphasize that these are great for creating demos, and you hear this all the time where it's like, I've got my app, it's 80% done, like all I got to do is get that last 20%. But it's really sort of helpful to remember that getting to an actual production state is quite intensive, and it's not necessarily something you can do in just a session. But picking the database, picking the cloud infrastructure, etc., is a really important skill beyond just knowing what the code is saying. Understanding, for example, how to use AWS, or knowing database selection, and trying to really kind of get into that as opposed to relying purely on low code tools will be really helpful, especially if you need to change it in the future, which is where people can get really stuck. All right, so let's see what we got. I think, too, the point as I'm doing this about, so I'm just going to run the Streamlit app. And again, if I'm actually talking about bringing this to like a production state, I would not use Streamlit. I would probably actually turn this into a React app, et cetera. And I would use AWS. I would probably use Postgres. Shout out to AWS S3 Vectors, which is about 90% cheaper than a lot of other vector stores. And yeah, just wanted to say that. Anyway, so let's see if this works. So I've got this interface where, to the earlier point made, Claude, could this be a little more beautiful? Maybe. But let's put something in here. So I'm going to just type AI engineer. This natural language search thing, you see really cool projects that other companies are doing. So it's searching. Okay, so it returned 46 results. And let's see, I think when you're looking at these systems too, you have to ask yourself, do the results make sense? I think oftentimes we'll create agents or AI systems and they look good, or we're doing these sort of ad hoc prompts, but you can't sleep on evaluation either. Having actual evaluation criteria, do these results make sense in a predictable way? And if it's not, can we improve the outputs, for example, by improving the prompt or changing what you're putting in the embedding space, et cetera. But some of this is looking okay. Does anybody have a prompt they maybe want, or a search they want to kind of suggest? If anybody in the audience wants to call something out.
Try fundraising, maybe.
Let's see, fundraising. Interesting. So we've got, looks like Triple Point Capital, looks like a managing partner, CFO related activities, and interesting stuff. And so I think when we're looking at these results, definitely more to say. We've got some venture capital related people. And when you're looking at doing this sort of semantic similarity comparison, you're usually looking at a numerical score. And generally with these kinds of things, you want it to be greater than 0.25 to have meaningful results. So in a lot of these cases, it looks like we've got 0.54, et cetera. And there's, I think, other things we could do to improve this interface. You see, we've got these sort of hard filters on the side as well. One thing I want to emphasize is this is set up so it should be able to say, if I only want people in California, for example, it should theoretically apply those filters automatically. Cannot sleep on filters. Oh, cool. So then we have the state working. Can't sleep on the hard filters when you're doing the semantic search. I can't overemphasize that. Definitely things I could do probably to improve this a little bit and experiment more rigorously with the results, but it's not a bad sort of prototype.
Awesome. Anybody else have more to share on their screens and progress? The prompts?
I'll show something super quick. So the designs are still getting generated with paper. Something interesting just happened. I'm just waiting for the screen share number to show up. But something interesting happened where you'll see that here, the paper MCP, it actually takes screenshots of what it makes And then it's not showing up. 1 second. So it basically takes screenshots of what it's designed in paper, and then it reviews the screenshots to make sure there aren't any issues or design inconsistencies. And you'll see that something ugly happened earlier where these boxes are not flexing to the amount of text inside. And I didn't even have to tell it that happened. Basically, it realizes, oh, there's this width issue with the mosaic where the cards are not filling properly. And then it was like, I know what's wrong. And then it went in and fixed it. And then the design was updated because of it. And so a lot of these agents have these loops that allow it to autocorrect itself, which is really cool. And so a lot of these things, if you notice the same mistake over and over again, you can really train them to never make the mistake again, or you can have it take a screenshot and review it and look into it for yourself. I'll show you a quick peek at what is going on in my paper file right now, but you'll see that now it's created like 5 different variations, and then now it's continuing to do something else. And so it's a very quick way to go through and, again, try a lot of different things.
Yes. I'm still adding like API keys, so it doesn't just work yet, but I can share my screen. So there's one more like very complicated one that like still running, but I guess I could show one more thing where for on the point of what should you do once there's like a minimum viable product to keep like improving it and like boosting functionality, right? I think like I've just asked it to like stress test. So one of the things that Claude Code also does, or like all these models, is once you have something that works, before like you'd have to have a dev that goes and like almost like stress tests the website, does unit tests. With these agents, what you can do is launch an agent swarm, which is like just multiple agents that like go and use the website for you, and like they can almost like peruse through the entire website, like find places that are like where there's gaps, and then find like almost like errors that you should resolve that would previously go unnoticed. So that's what I've been running to see if there's like some errors. But I guess like from you guys' perspective, what's one thing that we could work on improving and like iterating to make it like better? If you have any ideas. I think
Maybe proactively suggest that these groups of people are a good match instead of a query.
okay. That's good. Okay, so I could just
You're literally just typing in.
yeah. What I've seen is like I think there's a group of people that have like super detailed prompts, and then there's a group of people that have like very like almost like baby prompts, right? That are super simple. I think both of them work, and in the sense of I think if you're going super detailed, sometimes people think that they're being more detailed, but they're just reiterating the same thing again and again. At that point, like you lose the value. But another thing with the context window that I mentioned is if you have very simple prompts, it almost like limits how much of your context window is used up by the prompts, because like with every iteration that you make, the same prompt gets pushed on again and again. So if you can like almost deliver your message like very cleanly, it's way better than having a super detailed like almost like low value prompt, right? So what I've seen is these types of like simple just English prompts like almost do a good job as well. Just push this. Yeah, it's gonna take some time too.
Okay,
Like just run.
cool. Yes.
Yes, ideally you don't want to just paste your keys into the models. I've done that multiple times just out of laziness. But ideally, if you have like a production grade app on the note of security, like I think one of the biggest gaps with vibe coding is if you don't understand security and system architecture, once you deploy something like this, and if you're like handling like super sensitive data or like money, if someone's to hack your app, you're in trouble, right? So with the keys particularly, one of the things is use Gitignore. So if you're pushing it to GitHub repo, like there's a .gitignore file where you want to put like your environment variables so that they don't get pushed onto GitHub where like people can access them. And I think it was mentioned, but there's this thing called like the .env file, right? So some like here, this is my .env file, and like you can put all of your keys and secrets inside this one file. And this is where it's safe, where like you have to go in and manually put in these keys, right? So you can see like Anthropic API key, like you'd put that in here, and like all of them, and then this gets put into the .gitignore file. So this looks a bit complicated, but like this section here, where it's like the .env files are all like included into the file, so they don't get pushed anywhere outside, and it lives like locally within your system. Yes, and I think what you could do is limit the number of files that Claude can see. So it's not just that Claude can see your entire code base, right? There's some files that I haven't really experimented with that too much, but I think you could have the .env file not included into the local code base. So like with Claude exploring your entire code base, you can remove it for now and then just push it onto like wherever you're deploying your site. So I'll give you an example. It's like, I'm not sure how many servers you've used, but if you're hosting this live, if you're using something called like Railway or like AWS, for example, what you can do is just go and put your secrets on there. And when that runs, it just uses that env file that Claude hasn't looked at. So for testing, you can have a separate API key that isn't loaded or has like very small amounts for like prototyping. And then you can just go put your actual keys onto like the deployment zone. So Claude doesn't touch any of that.
I just want to emphasize too that the Gitignore, obviously critically important to do that, so you're not pushing that .env file to GitHub, which is generally where a lot of these repositories are hosted. Shout out as well to AWS Secrets Manager, which is sort of AWS's solution for that. On top of that, you want to have what's called defense in depth, where you can set up things like budgets, and you actually want to be able to have visibility and alerts critically if you are surpassing a monetary value. So say your API key is compromised for whatever reason, you can get an alert if it's like, oh, I've gone past $150 or whatever. AWS Cost Explorer, et cetera, they all have these. And one thing I want to emphasize as we're kind of working on this, which is tangential but important to kind of understand, to the point made earlier about understanding what your users are doing. I think a lot of people will build features speculatively without necessarily being like, this is what people want. And once you actually have users, even if you only have a couple hundred users, we've done these exercises a bunch of times, you want to do two things. One, use things like Microsoft Clarity or Full Story to actually be able to do session replays and actually look at what people are doing in this sort of privacy controlled way. And then two, actually interview users, give them a gift card to talk to you. You can get such powerful advice just from interviewing 15 people, and you can save a lot of pain not building things that are pointless. And oftentimes what people want is very different from what you think they want or what feels cool to build.
Is there another question?
I think that comes down to context, right? So context and your personal preference as well. I think there's small prototypes like this where it's ideal to not go all the way and fix every single issue and just fix it, almost like blockers that are preventing you from seeing the prototype, all the way up to if you're like in a big tech company where you can always keep on finding issues and it's better for you to keep on resolving more of them because it's a user facing product. The way that I like to think about this is almost the main issues you want to solve are obviously security, and version dependencies is another one. Like all the stuff that would cause the platform to go down or be less secure, you want to tackle those first. And you want to almost fix the most important issues first, right? And if it starts getting into smaller issues like, oh, the website isn't, the font is wrong, or very small things that you'd see Claude or hallucinating on as well, you want to probably stop over there. But usually, like when I was even interning, the best practices are you want to put these tests when someone's pushing a PR onto GitHub. So you want to do unit tests, Claude PR reviews, all these industry standard testing tools so that whenever someone pushes it, it just checks whether it fits the industry's requirements for what's okay and what's not. And once that's cleared, you don't want to test it anymore. But again, it's always a personal preference issue as far as it doesn't break down the whole thing. Manually do the stuff that's important that you wouldn't want to have like an agent test something like that you'd need trust for, right? If your agent's auditing your security, for example, that's probably like a bad idea because it's agent squared, right? So the agent wrote something, agent's reviewing itself. Usually that causes issues. But like if for the 20%, I'll just say review the most important stuff that isn't too strenuous yourself and then let the agents do other stuff where the agent's going to tell you that something's wrong. It's not going to just go and patch it yourself. So you can go look deeper into what it's helped reveal.
It wasn't working properly. Baseline advice.
Yeah, I think there's a YC startup from last year that does exactly that for you, where like it launches agents on your behalf to test your website. I forget the name, but I'm pretty sure you could find it. I think it's much easier because they've done the whole like pipeline and they're super specific. But what I think even on Cursor, like what you can do is have like a skill. That's always like a good thing where like you can just make a skill that's like test this and you want to be specific, I think, where like test one web page or test just the fonts instead of test like the whole website. And then you can just say launch an agent swarm to do this.
Compute is getting so much more expensive. I personally have burned a lot of
Tradeoffs, yeah. So one is there's this huge talk of like harnesses that's just come up, right? So like Cursor is a harness. It uses Claude, that's like an anthropic model, and it has like the interface for how the agent works, right? So there's like multiple new harnesses that have come out. There's one called High Coding Terminal. There's one called J-Code. There's so many where they change the system prompts so that you burn less tokens than Cursor or than Claude Code, for example. That's one. There's an extension called Caveman that I would Caveman.
Oh yeah, I saw this.
I think I would recommend that because what it does is it tells the model to respond as a caveman would, like super straight to the point. That stops like token like usage. And then third is there's like other companies that are like token optimizing prompts that you could look into. I've never used them. And then last one's obviously you as like the captain of the ship. Like you want to be super concise with like how you're dropping prompts. And then like also just using a cheaper model. Composer 2.5 is super like cheap versus Opus. Like that would be definitely be like recommended.
But can you then still upgrade? I mean, let's say you start with a cheap model and you try it.
Yeah, like here as well. Like you can just go from Composer to Opus and it's like completely clean, especially on Cursor. Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah.
Hey.
The first question, you can, anything you find yourself repeating, you can ask the agent to make a skill for you, and then it will live across all your projects. So anytime you're like, oh, I want you to do this thing, and you keep messing up or something, you can have it create a skill for itself, and then it will automatically invoke it when needed. And so, or you can invoke it yourself if you're like tired of repeating yourself. In terms of paper versus Claude design, I think paper is a canvas, and so you can actually go in and draw things and really have fine tuning with what you're doing. You can use it with any model. You can use it with Codex as well. You're not stuck using Claude. I think Claude design is more like it's just a different version of Claude code. It is a little bit more visual, and it has some skills baked into it that make it design things that are like maybe traditionally more aesthetic. I personally haven't found myself using Claude design that much, mostly because I just default to Claude code if I need to use Claude design. I think right now, especially in design, there are a lot of different tools emerging, and so really recommend playing with all of them and seeing which one works best for you. For me personally, I think all the tools are the same. They all do the same thing, and it really depends on which one you start with. I started with Cursor, and so I use Cursor a lot. Cursor is a little bit more visual. Like you said, it was like it shows you what's going on more. I think Claude is a little bit more black boxy. They're all very really similar though. Cursor will actually open the browser for you like in Cursor, so it feels a little bit more interactive that way. Their models are sometimes a little faster. On my work computer, I have Codex, Claude Code, and Cursor all running at the same time. And they're all just doing different things because I just started the project in different places.
Question over there.
Codex is really good for more complex work, but I found that recently it is better at one-shotting functionality in general. And then Claude is a little bit more creative. The stuff that Codex generates by default is not that pleasant to look at by default, but it usually works pretty well. I would say that recently it has been better than the Claude models.
Last question here.
That's a good point. I think that we've talked a lot about vibe coding these prototypes and alluded to security best practices, but generally you would want to select the larger tech stack that you're going to be using. And there's different tools. Railway came up as an example where you don't necessarily have to use like an AWS type of thing, but you'd want to basically have your repo living somewhere. Generally that's GitHub. And you would want to have your actual sort of code base itself be finalized with something that is generally front end system, that your sort of integration layer, database, et cetera. And so generally you'd want to finalize it in a way that you can then deploy it to, say, like an AWS. But you would actually want to be using a real database like Postgres, for example. Some people are using low-code tools like MongoDB is arguably a little lower code. But basically, it's a situation where you want to have authentication, a database, and an actual hosting platform. Most people are using AWS, Google Cloud, or Azure, but there's other sort of tools out there. Some people use Vercel as well to make deployment a little bit easier. But it's something that is relatively complex technically. It's not necessarily something you would want to pass to Claude to the point of doing that part manually. But yeah, generally you have your front end integration layer and then back end. Yeah, so you would create your repository, and that is something that you could have Claude or a similar model sort of QA and finalize. And then separately for, say, setting up your database and setting up your hosting infrastructure, you would do that separately, and then you would deploy the repository to, say, like an AWS using what's called a CI/CD pipeline. And there's ways that you can actually use Claude to do some of the provisioning of cloud resources. You can use Claude actually to use Terraform to create, say, like AWS resources or your database, et cetera. But you would want to set up those cloud resources and then deploy your code repository to that system. And even within that, there's different options like AWS Amplify versus CloudFront, for example, and there's even different databases that you can select. But it would be like you're taking your repository and deploying it against the cloud resources. Most people aren't doing on-prem, so I won't go there.
Awesome. All right. To wrap up, can you guys just each briefly or at a very high level summarize your steps that you would take to bring an idea to at least a V1 version? And then what's one final takeaway or a word of advice you would leave first-time vibe coders?
Yeah, so kind of similar to what I was just saying. I would take this concept and in the most simplistic way possible, I would probably deploy it to AWS. This might be a controversial take, but you don't need React for everything. And especially in the age of AI, you can actually do quite a lot with traditional sort of HTML and JavaScript. But I would deploy the system in a way I would probably use CloudFront, and I would store the code base on, or I would store the sort of code itself for the front end on S3, et cetera. And I would question if I needed a database, given there was only 336 operators. You might actually be able to get away with having this be just a file in S3 that's loaded dynamically. I don't know if that was high level, but basically I would do that as quickly as I could using this system that I've created. And then I would only make it more complicated if, say, we had thousands of operators or the situation called for it. But if we did what I just described, that could scale to a huge amount of users without having any sort of tech debt.
Yeah, so I guess typically at a high level, how I start is I will usually talk to an agent first. So I'll tell Claude, this is exactly what I want to build. Give me a step by step about how I can go about building it. I think, especially if you're new, it's like a really easy way to get an understanding of what it actually takes to build something. I think with AI, you can literally build anything you want and you can ask it to how to build anything you want. There's not really anything stopping you there. And then I would go through and I typically have a pretty long iteration phase where I can explore a lot of ideas. I'll use a variety of tools, whether it be Cursor, Claude Code, or Paper, and then I'll usually converge into the final thing. I typically use Vercel to deploy personal apps because it's really easy. It's just hooked up to GitHub, and so all my websites are deployed that way. In terms of advice for people, I think start building something today. I think if you have a personal project that you're really excited about, make it happen. A lot of people that I teach, I'll teach them how to make a personal Goodreads where you hook up your books that you read to a database and Notion, and then you build your own site that way. I think those types of mini projects for yourself are a really easy way to start. And then you can focus more on the enterprise use cases that are typically more complex because there's more data or more things involved.
Yeah, that's some really good advice. I think for me as well, very similar, just brainstorm with an agent or yourself as well, where when you know what you want to do, just break it down into actionable steps and as small of a chunk as you can, because that's what agents are really good at doing. And then once you've broken down your bigger problem into smaller steps, what you can do is come up with your own sprints almost, right? Different chunks of tasks that you should complete. And always have either a GitHub repository or some good platform where you can progress reliably, where as you're making changes, they don't just go away or it doesn't just crash the whole thing. So ideally a hub with Vercel where you can track the changes, make good improvements, and then just trust your intuition with fixing up what's wrong or keeping on enhancing the product that you have while keeping security in mind. And then one advice I think is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And that applies here, right? With agents, they're super quick and people are very tempted to run 20 agents, 30 agents at the same time and optimize, which I think people think is good, but sometimes like when you have so much stuff running at the same time, it almost breaks the whole thing. And there's recent studies that came out with the more tokens that people are blowing, they aren't making real progress. And that's because they're not really optimizing for output. They're only optimizing for tokens, right? Almost think about what you're doing. And then it's okay if you're going slowly. That's fine. You don't have to be the fastest person ever. And you're going to get a good output.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause to our participants. So hopefully you guys took away or able to take away something from today's session. This concludes our first session on live vibe coding, Iron AI Chef style. Definitely connect with them. Super friendly. I'm sure they'll ask or answer any additional questions that you guys may have. But we are going to take a quick break and do our second session. If you guys are signed up and have been approved for the second session, please definitely go and check in again because we really have limited space for each of these sessions. If you have not been approved, unfortunately, you can't stay because it is going to be a packed house. So, yeah, we're going to have to kick you out. But definitely take a few minutes just to network some more, and we're going to get started with our next session soon. So, thanks for coming, guys. Thank you.